Well, good evening and welcome, everyone. I'm Christine Nelson. I'm the Drew Hines Curator of Literary and Historical Manuscripts here at the Morgan and curator of our exhibition, This Ever New Self, Thoreau and His Journal. Now, the exhibition will be on view here until September 10th, and then, very appropriately, it goes to the Concord Museum in Thoreau's hometown for the fall. I can't tell you what a joy it is to be able to stand here tonight and welcome Laura Dassow Walls to the stage. It's just 2 weeks after the 200th anniversary of the birth of Henry David Thoreau. Now, there's a lot of wonderful writing and scholarship about Thoreau, and Laura and I have both benefited enormously from it. But something essential has been missing, and Laura has given us just the book we need. A meticulously researched, beautifully written, balanced, passionate, humane biography of this complex man. And Laura was just the right person to give us this important new book. She is the William P. and Hazel B. White Professor of English at the University of Notre Dame, and she's also associated with the graduate program there in History and Philosophy of Science. She has written and taught widely on American literature and science in its philosophical, political, and historical contexts. It was 22 years ago that she published her first book on Thoreau, Seeing New Worlds, Henry David Thoreau and 19th Century Natural Science. And she followed that with Emerson's Life in Science, The Culture of Truth, and more recently, The Passage to Cosmos, Alexander von Humboldt and the Shaping of America. She is co-editor of the Oxford Handbook of Transcendentalism, and she has an interesting new book in the works called Earthrise, which explores the 19th century concept of Earth as a living, self-making planet and its urgent contemporary implications. Now, Laura has been extremely generous to me as I developed the exhibition we have on view here. She responded with excitement and interest and humor when I conferred with her about the smallest and even the weirdest little details. We just spent a long and exhilarating day here at the Morgan today with 36 school teachers from around the country who are participating in a week-long NEH-funded workshop on Thoreau organized by the Concord Museum. And those teachers will go back to their classrooms to engage students with the ideas that we exchanged today. And as I understand it, that's been a pretty typical day for Laura this summer. As we're all gathered here in this hall tonight, we're just a stairway away from the simple green desk on which Thoreau wrote Walden and the essay we call Civil Disobedience and the thousands of pages of his journal. And one of the reasons we exhibit such an ordinary object is that it allows us to imagine the ordinary human being who sat before it day after day and year after year, making choices about what to write and how to live. Now, Laura's book helped me gain a richer understanding of Thoreau's complex thought and immense intellectual curiosity, of course, but it also underscored for me his profound connectedness with family and community, his wildness as well as his tenderness, and I thank you for that, Laura. Now, after Laura's talk tonight, she will be on hand just outside the hall to sign copies of her book and to chat, and the gallery will remain open until 8:30 in case you would like to stop in afterwards and have a look at some of the physical traces of Thoreau's whole human life. So I'm very, very happy now to introduce Laura Dassow Walls.
Thank you all, and I'm so pleased to be here. I did research here in the Morgan, of course, and to be here and see the hall with Thoreau, his journal spread, his letters and artifacts, it really is a dream come true, quite literally. And I want to thank Christine Nelson for just the marvelous work that she has done in putting together what I hope you realize is truly a groundbreaking exhibit. And if you combine this exhibit, as it will overlap with the Concord Free Public Library exhibit that's now hanging in the library in Concord, and when this exhibit moves up to Concord, and those two are in the same physical space, just half a mile from each other, I think the synergy between the two might be so powerful that we'll shift the Earth into a new orbit. So watch out when this exhibit moves. But anyway, thank you, Christine. It's been wonderful to work with you and very exciting. And thanks also to Paul Zadig. Actually, Paul, I need to find out how to pronounce your last name. And to Lyndon for all the help with the arrangements, because I know these things are complicated to put together. And more, all the people at the Morgan, Thoreau scholars speak with great reverence of this institution. It isn't just that the stuff landed here, it's that it's truly curated and treasured here and made available to scholars. All you have to do is walk in and get the authentication and sit in that room, and they're wonderful, bringing you the things you need to look at, and they're generous, and there they are, they're immaculately preserved. And these are the essential manuscripts. I mean, we have other collections, and I'll show you an image from the Huntington, who holds the manuscript of Walden. But the journals are truly the heart and the soul of Thoreau's life and career, and to have them here and to have them on display is truly a gift. So this particular talk centers on Thoreau's Walden enterprise, told a little bit through Walden and through the insights into that moment that you gain through the life and through the journals, and the way that moment, which is a kind of epitome, as he creates it in Walden, of the wholeness of his life. So, with no further ado, make sure my technology is at hand too. Ralph Waldo Emerson once wrote, "A man is a bundle of relations, a knot of roots, whose flower and fruitage is the world." Thoreau's roots were in Concord, Massachusetts, where he was born 200 years ago this month. If he had lived a normal lifespan, my grandmother could have shaken his hand. Our world is that close to his. Yet in some ways, Thoreau seems very distant from us today. He was mischievous, many-sided, paradoxical. His friends despaired of getting any truthful portrait of him on paper, and he gently mocked the notion that any human life can be fully fathomed. As he said, "What youthful philosophers and experimentalists we are! There is not one of my readers who has yet lived a whole human life." Nevertheless, each generation attempts to bring Thoreau alive, a tradition I follow using the journals, letters, and writings of Thoreau himself and his family and friends. The person I found in this written record had most certainly lived, in his words, a whole human life. Yet we have inherited a split Thoreau, two Thoreaus radically at odds with each other. One speaks for nature, the other for social justice. Curiously, both were hermits. Yet Thoreau was no hermit. What's more, his social activism and his defense of nature sprang from the same roots. He found society in nature, and nature he found everywhere, including the town center and the human heart. Thus, where others see schism, I see Emerson's bundle of relations and knot of roots, of which Thoreau's life and writing are the flower and fruit. That he was a loving son, a devoted friend, a lively and charismatic presence who filled the room, laughed and danced, sang and teased and wept, should not have to be said. But astonishingly, it does. Of course he could be, from time to time, icy, prickly, occasionally hermitous, and even a nag, as I hope my biography makes clear and even understandable. Because my real question is how he could be all that and also be a writer of world-class achievement, a natural scientist who gave us the deep poetry of nature writing, a political activist who, in the name of the common good, gave the weak their most powerful tool against the strong, and a spiritual seeker who encouraged every one of us to enter into the great experiment of life. Thoreau earned the devotion of friends who saw in him no saint, but something perhaps more rare, a human being living a whole human life. Once Henry Thoreau had made it clear he actually intended to live in that tiny sentry box he'd built out by Walden Pond, the townsfolk were full of questions. His most famous answer has been engraved on a sign by the original house site. "I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately, to front only the essential facts of life and see if I could not learn what it had to teach, and not, when I came to die, discover that I had not lived." This statement, Thoreau's famous avowal of purpose, not only addressed his friends' questions about why he went to the woods, it also addressed his bewilderment that we appear to have deliberately chosen the common mode of living, not because we genuinely prefer it to any other, but only because we think there's no choice left. Why, he asks, do we make such a strange assumption? Why do we allow ourselves to lead lives of quiet desperation? As he reminds us, alert and healthy natures remember that the sun rose clear. It is never too late to rethink the choices we make of how we think and live. By the time he went to Walden, Thoreau was already an anti-slavery activist and a passionate social reformer. He had spent 7 months living in New York City in 1843, and those months had taught him that slavery was not an isolated problem confined to the American South, but a symptom of a far larger problem. For he saw his countrymen enslaving themselves to false political leaders and to the destructive industrial capitalist economy they twisted into America's so-called manifest destiny, a destiny which alienates us from ourselves, from each other, and from the land. Thoreau's solution was learning to live deliberately, living with the freedom to read the world in its fullness and weigh with care the choices we make in it. This, he insisted, could be practiced anywhere, not just at Walden. This was the lesson he brought with him when he returned home to Main Street in the heart of Concord, where he continued to engage deeply, if, be it said, on his own terms, with town society and with the concerns of his fellow citizens. Ironically, Thoreau's path to this woodland pond on the edge of town opened not by deliberation but by sheerest chance. Late in September 1844, Ralph Waldo Emerson celebrated turning in the proofs of his book Essays, second series, by taking a walk to Walden Pond. The railroad had just punched through Concord right over Walden's prettiest shore, and that's Walden Pond on the left of this slide. Land speculators already had their eye on Walden Woods right across the tracks. Who should Emerson run into but a handful of men bidding on Wyman's Field, an overgrown patch alongside Walden Road? So some of you haven't been to Concord, so to orient you, here is an early map showing the essential landscaping. And part of the point here is to remind us how close Walden Pond was, really very much a part of the town of Concord itself. So there is Concord Center, right in here. The main road out of town, Walden Road, one of them winds down right past Walden Pond here, and the railroad curves down and right across the other side. Thoreau's house site is right caught in between the two, And here is the popular, it was really a road down to the popular fishing hole, which is right in here. You get a sense of the cohesion of this landscape by sort of meditating on this map. Well, one thing led to another. Emerson walked home, the owner of 11 acres of briar patch. The next day, Thoreau and Bronson Alcott came out to the patch with Emerson and pointed out to him that that briar patch was worthless without the neighboring pine grove. So Emerson bought that too. They all agreed that it was the perfect place for Emerson's summer house, a poet's lodge where the great writer could retreat with book and pen when the good hours come. Well, this idea was not new. Writers' shanties and wilderness retreats were all the rage just then, and Thoreau himself had long dreamed of living by the pond, ever since he'd spent an idyllic summer during his senior year at Harvard, living on nearby Flint's Pond. It's now Sandy Pond, just out of range of this, just over the rise. Oh, I've got this backwards. Just over the rise on, this thing is not cooperating with me. There it comes. Just over the rise on this side. Just ever since he'd spent a summer there, living with his college roommate, Charles Stearns Wheeler, who we think with Thoreau's help had built one of these retreats right on the shore of Flint's Pond. Well, looking at this new property of Emerson's on Walden Pond, Thoreau's friend Ellery Channing gave him a nudge. Hey, you should go out to Emerson's briar patch. And as Ellery said, build yourself a hut, and there begin the grand process of devouring yourself alive. Well, sure enough, early in 1845, Thoreau and Emerson shook hands on the deal. It would be Thoreau, not Emerson, who would build his Poet's Lodge by Walden Shore. At the end of March 1845, Henry Thoreau borrowed an axe, probably from Bronson Alcott, walked down to the shore of Walden Pond and began to build. So don't feel sorry for Emerson. He kept buying more property. Once the bug bit him, he basically saved Walden Pond from development. So there's a lovely walk up to Emerson's Cliff on the opposite side of the pond, and Emerson bought that property too, and Alcott drew up plans for Emerson's house or lodge up on that cliff top. It never got built, but that was okay. Emerson loved to go up there, and he had a bench, and that was a favorite retreat for people. So, like I say, don't feel sorry for Emerson. He never got his lodge at Walden Pond, but he had other places to go. Thoreau already knew where his house would be. Nestled, the granite posts here mark the house site. An archaeologist unearthed the house site in 1945. Nestled on a shoulder of land sloping down to the water, facing southeast to the morning sun, shaded by chestnuts and tall, arrowy white pines. He cut down a few of those pines and hewed them 6 inches square to make timbers for his house. When the curious came by, lured by the sound of his axe, he paused in his work to chat with them over the pine chips. Early in April, he bought an Irish hillock shanty from James Collins, an Irish railroad worker who was moving on up the line, dismantled it, and carted the boards from the Irish village just around the bay. Once the frame was ready to be raised, he called in his friends to help. Emerson, of course, Alcott and Channing, also the Curtis brothers, the farmer, Edmund Hosmer, with his 3 strong sons. Together they set the king post, an entire tree, solid into the bottom of the cellar, and raised the frame up around it. Once Thoreau had finished the floor and boarded and roofed the building with Collins' good boards, he had a light and airy house, 10 feet by 15 and 8 feet tall in move-in condition, at least for summer weather. That fall, he finished up the chimney, shingled the roof and sides, and plastered the interior. Now he had a weatherproof and insulated house that would keep him warm in even the coldest New England winter. All of it, he proclaims with a Yankee flourish, for $28, 12 1/2 cents. Top that. As spring advanced, Thoreau broke ground on his farm, hiring a team of oxen and a man to drive them. Together, they cut furrows into 2.5 acres of the briar patch near Walden Road, pulling out enough stumps to supply Thoreau with fuel for 2 winters. He planted the sandy soil with rows of white bush beans, 7 miles of them in all, mostly for the market, plus potatoes, peas, turnips, and corn, mostly for himself. It was hard labor, he wrote, making the earth say beans instead of grass, but I come to love my rows. They attach me to the earth. After each day's labor, he walked home to his family in town, just a little over a mile by the railroad tracks. Finally, early that summer, he borrowed a hayrick, loaded it with books, writing supplies, and a few pieces of furniture, and drove to his new address on Walden Pond. It was Friday, the 4th of July, 1845. A cloudy day at first, but that afternoon, as he unpacked and arranged his new life, the sun came out and shone on his own personal declaration of independence. The next morning, Thoreau opened a fresh notebook with a flourish, and there's the famous one. July 5th, 1845, yesterday I came here to live. Here in this airy house, open to the breezes, he could reflect and write like a double of the pond. Walden, is it you? He asked in astonishment. As he wrote, his handwriting bubbled into loops of ecstasy. You can see some of that, You can see some of that starting down here. The later pages after this just truly get just like, it's like he's dancing, yeah. Others have called, let's see, I'll put up one. Okay, no more slides for a little bit. When I come back to slides, you know that we're winding up. Others have called Thoreau's Walden shelter a cabin, a hut, or a shanty, but Thoreau himself almost always called it a house, insisting on the solidity and dignity he'd worked so hard to attain. As Emerson said, cultivated people cannot live in a shanty. Thoreau's whole experiment hinged on this distinction. If he had built nothing but a poet's lodge for the good hours, his move would have bothered nobody, because lots of people were doing that. It was spending all his hours there that mattered. Outbuildings or vacations, retreats, only exercised a self already established. What Thoreau wanted was a whole house that would embody a whole new self, such that building that house meant building that self, literally from the ground up. To be sure, it was small, a kind of sentry box, a watchtower on the verge of the world. To his family, it looked dangerous, or at least really uncomfortable. On his first night away, his mother, Cynthia, and his sister, Sophia, were so worried about him that they tossed and turned all night. Until at dawn, Cynthia got up and packed some food, and Sophia brought it to her preoccupied brother. She reported back that he didn't like to receive it very well. And the house seemed very bare of everything. Oh, they missed him very much. Nevertheless, Henry's family supported him staunchly and agreed to let him carry out his experiment in his own way. But why exactly did Henry Thoreau go to Walden Pond? On one level, the answer is easy. He went there to write. Instead of claiming a little corner, a little space for his writing desk, an alcove or an attic, and a communal household, now he would claim an entire life, declaring to the whole wide world that from now on, writing would be the central hub of his whole being. Instead of living a little and then writing about it, his life would be one single integrated act of composition. He put it to himself like this, quote, "I wish to meet the facts of life, the vital facts, face to face, and so I came down here. Life, who knows what it is, what it does?" This declaration of purpose has the force of a vow, a sacred commitment to confront face to face the conditions of possibility for life itself. At the moment that he wrote those words, on his second day, sitting at that little green writing desk by the window, the pond glinting through the pines outside, he had no guarantee that this experiment would work. He knew only that he had to try. As he wrote, "If I am not quite right here, I am less wrong than before." His avowed purpose was profoundly religious. He imagined his house as a temple made of white pine, seasoned and seasoning still to eternity, he wrote. Natural and welcoming as the shade of a tree. Eating would be not the mere getting of food, but a sacred act, a sacrament sitting at the communion table of the world. And writing? After the long lapse of centuries, it was time, he declared, for, quote, "the written word, the scripture, to be heard." Instead of collating scriptures of other lands and peoples, Christian, Hindu, Buddhist, now he would write a new one, a sacred book for the modern age, for his age, an age of expanding railroads and global industrialism, rampant consumerism, mass migration, and the exploitation of workers, some of the Irish laborers that he met while he worked, slavery and Indian genocide, the Mexican War, environmental destruction. In other words, a world an awful lot like our own. If Thoreau ever imagined that retiring to the pond would offer an escape from all this, he soon learned it was just the opposite. Never before had he been so conspicuous. His house stood near the highway, just over a low rise from a popular road to the pond, right next to a favorite fishing hole. People took to starting conversations with him. There was the townsman, as Thoreau tells it, driving a pair of cattle to market, who inquired of me how I could bring my mind to give up so many of the comforts of life. I answered that I was very sure I liked it passably well. I was not joking. "Sir, I like your notions," said a passing railroad worker. "I think I shall live so myself." In his solitude, Thoreau became a sort of magnet. He welcomed most folks, especially children who were glad to be in the woods, and young women who looked in the pond and at the flowers and improved their time. Travelers on the road traded barbs with him as he hoed his beans. As beans? So late, they would say. The pond, too, was hardly some private preserve, as his friend Horace Hosmer loved to reminisce in old age. And I'm quoting Horace here, and I wish I could do the accent, sorry. "For 100 years certain, Walden has been visited at all seasons of the year by hunters, sportsmen, boys, wood choppers, landowners. Why, men would drink for long hours at a tavern in town and then on a bet go for a swim across the pond, even at midnight. And visitors? Hosmer worked at Walcott's Grocery and Restaurant, and let me tell you, he packed up many a picnic basket for Thoreau's visitors. All sorts of people, he'd say, at all hours. And, he'd wink, those baskets were generally loaded for two. Nor was the pond off limits to family. They made a custom of visiting Henry on Saturday afternoons, and on Sundays Henry repaid the visits. Friends recalled his mother's pleasure that her son came home every week to eat a deliciously prepared dinner which their old family cook took pains to have as perfect as she knew how. Sometimes he dined with the Emersons, too. or the Alcotts, or the Hosmers. Emerson's son, Edward, was just a baby then, but when he grew up, he was astonished to hear that his friend Thoreau was supposed to have cut off all family ties, instead of, as he wrote, appearing a welcome guest at the fireside of friends. He came for friendship, not for food. That is, Thoreau made a point of maintaining his friendships as before. And how hurt Mother Cynthia would have been had her own son refused her famously generous table. And he kept on taking jobs as a town handyman, just as he'd done for years, jobs on which he depended for his modest but still necessary income. For $1 a day, Thoreau built fences, painted houses, did carpentry, bricked up chimneys, often for Emerson. In a way, moving out to the pond had changed nothing, for in many ways he went about his life much as he'd always done. Yeah, but of course it changed everything. Never before had he been so self-sufficient or enjoyed such control over how he spent his hours. Even after he moved back to town, he never lost this new sense of independence, and never before had he attracted so much attention. Living as the younger son in the bustling communal Thoreau household, or as yet another inmate in the lively Emerson household, that intellectual hub of transcendentalism, Thoreau had been virtually invisible. But living alone, out on the pond, in view of the road, in ostentatious simplicity, he became a spectacle. It's not clear that he anticipated any of this. His original determination to live deliberately and confront only the essential facts of life that was voiced so movingly in his earliest days at the pond shows that he went there intending to pursue an inward journey. But the circumstances that made that journey possible meant that it would be performed on a very public stage. So his 2 years, 2 months, and 2 days living at Walden Pond would become and would forever remain an iconic work of performance art. The surprise is how quickly and effectively Thoreau understood what was happening and pivoted his vision and purpose and voice to take advantage of it, starting with those very first curious passers-by who were drawn in by the sound of his axe. After all, what good is a reporter, even of God himself, without someone to report to? As soon as Thoreau found himself explaining himself to another, the conditions for Walden, the book, were laid. But those conditions built in a certain irresistible damage that Thoreau could not control. His self-declared experiment demanded pure intentions and an integrity of purpose, which from the first, as we saw, he had cast in religious terms as the devotional retreat of the religious hermit. And indeed, many have called his Walden house a hermitage. But choosing to pursue this devotional path as a middle way, not way out in the wilderness, but right there on the edge of town, just far enough to be seen clearly, as the philosopher Stanley Cavell has said, forced Thoreau, this intensely solitary introvert, to devise a public persona that could stand up to all the scrutiny and defend his private self from the glare of publicity. Paradoxically, he found himself living like an innkeeper, openly, out on the highway, with no lock on the door, as he says, offering hospitality and a good story to anyone who came by, no matter what their motives. But as he remarked, the innkeeper keeps an inn, not a conscience, hence the bind. Because Thoreau was also the town gadfly and keeper of the public's conscience. Therefore, his every act was a sermon, and his every encounter, even those casual meetings on the road, became a challenge to explain, to justify, to proselytize. From then on, there would be no casual meetings with Henry T. As word spread, circumstances he hadn't anticipated and could not control were turning him into a new kind of being, the product of modern commerce and communications, a celebrity. Meeting Thoreau became an event, the kind of thing that one would retail to posterity, and as a consequence, all those harmless and loving dinners at home, where he dropped off his laundry, caught up on the news, packed in a good meal, maybe did a few chores, and carried away a pie for breakfast, laid him open in after years to endless charges of hypocrisy. No other American writer has been so discredited for enjoying a meal with loved ones, or for not doing his own laundry. But from the very beginning, such charges have been used to silence Thoreau. The immediate result of all this was that Thoreau, who went to Walden Pond to write one book, instead wrote two. The first, the one he'd been planning all along to write, was A Week on the Concord and Merrimack Rivers. This was his elegy for his beloved brother John, who died in his arms 3 years before, and for the world they'd shared together growing up, a world that was swiftly passing away. Into this intensely personal and private work, Thoreau poured all the passion and poetry of his younger self. The second book, Walden, was something else again. It was born on that first morning at the pond when he opened his new journal by announcing why he'd come there to live. Here his voice is wholly new, bold, lyric, yearning, prophetic, confrontational. Not the voice of a confiding poet, but of a prophet and a teacher discovering how, since it turns out he's up on a soapbox, to raise his voice so that the world will hear. From then on, there would be two Thoreaus. One, quiet, introspective, self-questioning, occasionally depressed, and often in poor health. The other, brash, boastful, self-certain, loud and healthy as the rooster crowing to bring in the dawn. From then on, he would wrestle uneasily with this new creation, Thoreau, this outsized doppelganger, hermit on a soapbox born in those first conversations over the pine timbers of a house still raw with pitch and splinters, who grew up to narrate his creator's life to the whole wide world. Well, taking charge of this new character meant consciously organizing his newly simplified life at the pond into widening circles of responsibility. House, neighbors, nature. Start with house. His house would hold everything needed and nothing more. The simple green-painted pine writing desk, which you can all step outside and see if you haven't already, held his notebooks. There may have been no lock on his front door, but there was a lock on his desk. And as you can see, the wear in the wood shows he used it, keeping his writings under lock and key. One chair sat at his desk, plus two more, and a little three-legged table that held a few books. Extra visitors spilled over onto the sturdy little cane bed behind the door, a bed that was low enough for visiting children to climb onto, but high enough, they recalled in later years, that their feet didn't quite touch the floor. Simplify, simplify, he would write. For vanity, he kept a 3-inch looking glass. For cleanliness, a dipper and a wash basin. For water, all of Walden Pond. If he had a privy, no record of it survives. Although I just heard that there's a team of archaeologists who are going to do some soil sampling. Yeah, seriously. So we may have the answer to that. For a kitchen, at first he cooked in a hole in the earth lined with stones, but after he'd finished his chimney, he cooked on a hearth, and then later on a stove. For kitchenware, he had a kettle, a skillet, and a frying pan, a jug for oil and another for molasses, plus 3 plates, 2 knives, 2 forks, 1 spoon, and a cup. No wonder his visitors brought picnic baskets. As for neighbors, in one of Walden's most famous one-liners, Thoreau declared he kept 3 chairs, 1 for solitude, 2 for friendship, 3 for society. His friends came by often, but he often went out and found society as well, sometimes by accident, like the time he got caught in a sudden thunderstorm and ran for shelter to a nearby hut, where he found the honest, hard-working Irishman John Field with his broad-faced boy at his side and his brave wife Mary with an infant on her knee, all longing to catch a piece of the American dream. The owner of Baker Farm had hired John, newly arrived, to bog for $10 an acre in the use of the land for a year. It was a hard, old country sharecropper's life. A bad bargain, worried Thoreau. With all the American horizon before him, John Field seemed stuck in his old boggy Irish ways, thinking to live by some derivative old country mode in this primitive new country. Thoreau noticed that living in this new country proved hard for other immigrants too, like his neighbor Hugh Coyle, who'd been a soldier at Waterloo before emigrating from Ireland to America, where, like John Field, he too had become a ditcher or a bogger. Soon after Thoreau moved in, the alcoholic old man collapsed on Walden Road, just down the road, and died. Thoreau, troubled, spent an afternoon studying Coyle's eerie, weed-infested house before the town burned it down. These experiences turned Thoreau's attention outward to the others who lived in Walden Woods. Ruined houses, ruined lives. One had to look hard to see their traces, but Thoreau found them. Hugh Coyle was not an anomaly, but the last survivor of a struggling community, a rural slum of outcasts, drunks, and derelicts. There was Cato Ingraham, an enslaved man from Africa, who in 1795 had moved out to Walden Wood to live in a little house built for him by his owner in exchange for his labor. There was John Wyman the potter, who had squatted in the same house that became Hugh Coyle's, digging the clay for his earthenware pottery from the silty banks of the pond. There was Zilpah White, enslaved until the Revolution, who had declared her freedom afterward by building a one-room house and living as a hermitess for over 40 years. There was Brister Freeman, a conquered slave who'd fought in the Revolution and declared his own independence by his choice of last name. After the war, he'd bought an acre of land just north of Walden Pond, Brister's Hill, where he planted an orchard and raised a family with his African wife, Fenda, who told fortunes, recalled Thoreau, yet pleasantly. Nearby stood the tiny house of John Breed the barber, which local boys burned down in 1841. Thoreau had raced out behind the fire bell to watch it burn and commiserated the next night with Breed's son, a field hand who'd come by to mourn the loss of his childhood home. As Thoreau explored these and others, the neighborhood's ruins and cellar holes, a surprising reality emerged. This had once been a little village of former slaves, day laborers and immigrants, nearly all of them squatters, and all of them without money. Yet they'd had houses and gardens and chickens, families and lives, dreams. Why out by Walden Pond? The road behind Thoreau's house had once been the great country road from Boston to New Hampshire, but after 1785, when a shortcut was opened, it was just Walden Road, leading to nowhere in particular, through land that was too rocky and sterile to farm. The land's owners didn't care enough about it to evict squatters, so Walden Woods became a place where the impoverished, the displaced, and abandoned could go and scrabble out a living. That is, Walden Pond was open land not because it was valued, but because it wasn't. What Thoreau was studying at Walden was how to see in the wastelands at the margins of commerce the center of a new system of value. Seeing this meant widening one's sense of responsibility to the largest circle of all, beyond house, beyond neighbors, to the world of nature. Or perhaps it was the circle of nature that widened to include himself. Either way, Thoreau felt a powerful intimacy. He wrote, "What sweet and tender, the most innocent and divinely encouraging society there is in every natural object. I was so distinctly made aware of the presence of my kindred, even in scenes which we are accustomed to call wild. Each night he fell asleep to the sounds of wind and wild animals, and each dawn he awoke to a world where human beings did not dominate, where the outdoors came inside with the summer air, carrying the scents of pine and the sounds of birds. His first kindred was the mouse who built her nest under his house and did not fear him, but came to pick up the crumbs at his feet, running over his shoes and up his legs inside his pants. Instead of shooing it away, Thoreau invited it closer. When I held it a piece of cheese, it came and nibbled between my fingers and then cleaned its face and paws like a fly." Someone memorialized Thoreau's little friend by drawing a mouse on the back of his door. In time, stories multiplied of Thoreau's mystical bond with the wild creatures of Walden, how with one whistle he could summon a woodchuck, with another a pair of squirrels, with a third various birds, including a crow who would come and nestle on his shoulder. The legend grew of Thoreau as a modern Orpheus who, like the ancient Greek poet, could draw creatures to him and charm them with his music. Or an American St. Francis of Assisi, the patron saint of ecology, who preached to the birds and tamed even the ferocious wild wolf with his blessing. Ridiculous, thought his Yankee townsman. When woodchucks started ravaging his beans, Thoreau asked a local farmer how to trap them without injury. "Yeah, shoot him, you damn fool," he snapped back. For all the legends of sweet, wild harmony at Walden, Thoreau was well aware there was at least as much conflict there. Living simply out in the woods did not eliminate problems. It only made them easier to see. Take shelter, for instance. Building even this simplest of smallest of houses to satisfy the most essential needs meant negotiating permission with the landowner, chopping down young trees and borrowing an axe to do so, also caring for that axe, returning it, Thoreau bragged, sharper than before. It meant securing the help of friends to raise the house and bargaining for the boards to close it up. And it meant discovering that his house was never really closed at all. Ants and field mice had moved in there before he did. Simply building a little house had catalyzed around it a whole army of helpers and rivals and detractors. Worse yet was that other obvious essential, food. Planting beans was Thoreau's way of teaching a basic fact forgotten by the whole of philosophy. Plant life is the foundation of all human intellect. Confronting this meant entangling himself with 7 tedious miles of beans and their many associates, starting with a brace of oxen whose strength he needed to break open the hard soil, plus a man to provide the plow and drive the oxen. It meant acquiring, by gift or purchase, the seed to plant, hoping for rain, but not too much, to water the ground, and deploying a hoe, an edged weapon from a plant's perspective, to drive back the weeds, all performed in view of passers-by who jeered at his refusal to add manure, which would have, of course, involved hiring a bogger, that is, a John Field, exploiting a John Field. And what to do about the woodchucks? If they wrecked his bean crop, the whole economic foundation of his experiment would collapse. Shoot him, you damn fool? Or should he do what Alectharion the woodchopper did, kill him and put the carcass in the cooking pot? Well, Thoreau tried that. He tells us, once I went so far as to slaughter a woodchuck which ravaged my bean field and devour him partly for experiment's sake. He enjoyed it too, he admitted. But he couldn't think that this was, in the long term, precisely a good practice. Friends noticed that Thoreau ate whatever they served, even meat, rather than make a fuss over their dinner table. But when he was alone, high up on his new ethical platform, Thoreau fussed plenty. How could he eat animals without worrying about the ethics of eating animals? How could he condemn savagery in others when he was evidently part predator himself? Fishing posed a real dilemma for him because he loved to fish. And he saw fishing as the harmonious integration of humans and nature. But did his new mystic spiritual life at the pond include killing to eat? Even killing fish? Could he live on apples, nuts, and berries, as his friend Alcott was recommending? Was his robust appetite for fish a sin, or was it a sacrament? Thoreau did not stop killing and eating fish, which bothers my purist students, but there it is. But he did start worrying about it. He wrote, I find I cannot fish without falling a little in my own self-respect. So he's fretting, right? Always I feel it would have been better if I had not fished. Over the years, his Deliberations evolved into his conflicted defense of vegetarianism in Walden's chapter on higher laws. And then there were the arrowheads that rattled against the blade of his hoe as he worked his bean field. They told him that the corn he planted was seeding furrows originally opened by Indians. In a real and literal way, his act of creation displaced even the memory of a people who had been violently forced off their homelands. In the open and simplified setting of Walden Woods, not only was Thoreau more visible to himself as well as his neighbors, but his neighbors were more visible too, all his neighbors, non-human as well as human, past and future as well as present. As the nature and extent of his relations dawned on Thoreau, his questions multiplied. What are these pines and these birds about, he asked. What is this pond doing? I must know a little more and be forever ready. In short, Thoreau discovered that even his most simplified life offered no simple way to avoid causing some form of harm to others. No easy way to resolve the long history of conflict, struggle, and displacement evident in these woods. So he began to imagine a new role for himself, looking after the wild stock of the town, which, since they were part of the town commons and owned by no one, had been ignored and abused. And if he couldn't cure the woodchuck problem, at least he could work himself up to a state of reconciliation. Writing, these beans have results which are not harvested by me. Do they not grow for woodchucks partly? There was no word in Thoreau's lifetime for what we now call ecology, but his growing awareness turned his thought far in advance of his time to ecological relationships in which humans participate but cannot declare dominance, as well as to historical struggles and inequalities that laid the foundation for his political thinking on power and justice. It was while at Walden that Thoreau orchestrated his arrest for non-payment of taxes in protest, of course, of the Mexican War, slavery, and the extermination of Native Americans. It was at the pond that he hosted anti-slavery meetings and welcomed, by historical record, at least 2 fugitive slaves. nearing the end. The gesture that crystallized Walden from a chronicle of days into a visionary whole, a cosmogram, capable of capturing his new cosmology, occurred in January 1846, as soon as Walden had frozen hard enough to bear his weight. For at least a week, perhaps two, perhaps alone, but probably with an assistant, Thoreau surveyed the pond. This is harder than it sounds. It took severe study, hard physical labor, the instruments of surveying, concentrated mathematical skill, not to mention practice with the instruments of technical drafting. But he did it, creating a remarkable work of art. Here's the final published version of it. A working survey that accurately mapped Walden Pond to the inch in 3 dimensions, length, breadth, and depth. And I would say accurately, not only in his terms, but the survey has been redone a couple of times, and modern instrumentation and modern surveyors have confirmed that it's accurate, basically to the inch. He said that he did it to prove the pond had a bottom, for legend had it that the town's favorite lake was bottomless. In fact, it had a measurable depth, 102 feet, making Walden the deepest inland body of water in Massachusetts. Thank goodness, he wrote, this pond was made deep and pure for a symbol. What exactly it symbolized would take him the entire book to explain, so I won't try to explain it all to you right now. But by the spring of 1846, he had a start. The line of greatest breadth intersects the line of greatest length at the point of greatest depth or height. This, he wrote, was a universal law, true for ethics as well as mechanics. It is the heart in man. It is the sun in the system. Draw lines through the length and breadth of the aggregate of a man's particular daily experiences and volumes of life into his coves and inlets, and where they intersect will be the height or depth of his character. Walden took shape here in these 2 key discoveries. First, that the pond had a hard bottom, as he said, and rocks in place which we can call reality and say, this and no mistake. Thoreau's quest for the bottom of the pond was also his quest for a bedrock truth, a face-to-face confrontation with reality underneath all the fake news, the mud and slush of opinion. But once you found that bedrock truth, what should you do about it? This was his second discovery. Each person's answer will depend upon and will reveal the exact height, breadth, and depth of their individual moral character. The angle intersections inscribed by our particular daily experiences, the coves and inlets of our lives, will ground the decisions we make, our actions in the world. And the sum total of all of our individual moral actions, all combined together, will constitute the ethical character or the lack thereof of the society that we build together. Thoreau built his house to last. And it's easy to imagine him living there all his life, growing old and crotchety under the pines, grumbling about the railroad that crossed by the time he left the pond 20 times a day. This is taken from right in front of his house site. So here was his crotchety answer. I cross it like a cart path in the woods. I'll not have my eyes put out and my ears spoiled by its smoke and steam and hissing. Well, indeed, the iconic crotchety hermit of American folklore and fable lives there still. But Thoreau, the living person, did move back to town, though in later years he did wonder why. He often wished himself back. But Waldo Emerson needed to go away lecturing in Europe, and his wife Lydian asked Henry to live with her while he was gone, about a year, to manage the Emerson household and be a father to their children. Thoreau's life at Walden had been Waldo's greatest gift to him. If his friends needed a favor in return, he would say yes, even if it meant leaving Walden Pond to do so. So, on September 6, 1847, Henry Thoreau loaded up his books and furniture, closed his door, and left his house on Walden Pond for good. Soon after, Emerson leased the house to his gardener, who moved it closer to the road. Eventually, it became a corn crib on a nearby farm, and eventually rotted away into oblivion. I see that there's a few nails in the exhibit here. Walden the book, was born in face-to-face conversations and took shape when Thoreau gathered his answers into lectures for his friends and neighbors at the Concord Lyceum. At that point, his house and his life could authenticate his every word. Hey, come see for yourself. But by the time he published Walden in 1854, Walden was gone. Well, the pond was still there, but the trees were gone. They'd been logged off to feed the railroad. His house was gone too, just another weedy cellar hole. If the meaning of his life lived there were to live on, he must recreate his performance as a book, a work of art. Convert the material place, the wooden-floored house reeking of wood smoke and damp wool, with pine needles tracked in underfoot, and a little drawing of a mouse on the door, into a space of words. What time had swept away, Thoreau would resurrect through art. As he dedicated himself to perfecting Walden, he put off for everything else, refusing to compromise with time. As he added the finishing strokes, it suddenly expanded before the eyes of the astonished artist into the fairest of all the creations of Brahma. You'll recognize the fable of the artist of Kuru from the closing pages of Walden. On the title slide, Thoreau emblazoned his motto: I do not propose to write an ode to dejection, but to brag as lustily as Chanticleer in the morning, standing on his roost, if only to wake my neighbors up. And on his final page, his Chanticleer's call greeted the eternal dawn. And this is the page from the Huntington. And until I saw this, I had no idea how he ornamented this final few words. Only that day dawns to which we are awake. There is more day to dawn. The sun is but a morning star. The ceremony Thoreau had enacted at Walden Pond and reenacted in Walden the book created a kind of miracle, scripture written in our own time for our own time by a man both in and out of time itself. Thank you.